Good morning. My name is Susanne Ledanff. I'm associate professor at the University of Canterbury in Christchurch, and not coming from Christchurch directly, but from Berlin. Kind of travel a bit between the two cities. I also have my conference paper on both of my cities, Berlin and Christchurch. The first slide got missing. Doesn't matter. The conference contribution is in the conference proceedings. I changed the title slightly, and I'll talk about art and other creative projects in transient or transitional spaces in Berlin after the fall of the wall, and in Christchurch after the earthquakes 2010-2011. So my paper aims at a comparison of the artistic and creative uses of transitional spaces in Berlin and Christchurch, and the crucial question is how contemporary creative uses of these transient urban spaces, whether vacant sites or derelict or abandoned buildings, be compared in cities as different as Christchurch and Berlin. And this is what I will look at, but I will mention a few more details on Christchurch. Berlin probably is better known for the historical events, the fall of the wall in 1989. And so if we compare, the starting point is the urban fabric. In Berlin, rather, fallow lands, derelict buildings, abandoned factories, and I look rather more at the beginning, the early years, the 90s, in the Berlin Aufbruch, the new beginning, some historically charged Berlin voids, and only very briefly temporary exhibition buildings at the Schlossplatz. Christchurch, to say a few more words about the earthquakes. That was on the 4th of October 2010, and a more devastating one on 10th of February 2011, which claimed the lives of 184 people and thousands and thousands of aftershocks. So what we have in terms of fabric in Christchurch are empty sites. So it's interesting. We have just heard about public space created by demolition. So we look at some very new organizations, initiatives in Christchurch, mainly gap filler, the Outer Spaces program of the Art Gallery, FESTA, that's the Festival of Transitional Architecture, Art Voice Christchurch. There are a number of grassroots initiatives, and finally I want to make a comparison going back to Berlin to the artist-run spaces in Berlin today. This is, of course, I make a few comparisons now. Seeing the healing of the wounds in both cities. In Berlin, the scars of the past, which had to be confronted in the turbulent rebuilding after Unification, the destruction of World War II, the division of the city, stagnation and shrinking, bad planning and deindustrialization. The scar of the war in 1989. And in Christchurch, certainly a lot of memory practices all over the city, and you can certainly think of the therapeutic aspects of installations, events, artworks, and public space, and community projects. And so this is something I will rather skip in this paper today. It's in the proceedings. That is certainly a completely different background. The critical earthquake in Berlin of the fall of the wall, and the historical, political circumstances which led to these famous Berlin voids in the heart of the city, and for example, or mainly at the Schlossplatz after the demolition of the historical that Schloss, so what I just want to show are at a later period temporary exhibitions and temporary uses of the palace of the Republic before it was demolished. Yeah, the Schlossplatz 2000 exhibition of washing machines. Then the opening of the Palace of the Republic in 2004, of the fun event, the interior. My point is also that we look, in Berlin we look at, in the course of the rebuild, city rebuilding, mass spectacles, for example the Festival of Cranes, which attracted hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people. And that means that we have certainly a number of top-to-bottom initiatives versus the bottom-to-top initiatives. The closest you can get in Christchurch to these mass spectacles was the Festa, the Festival of Transitional Architecture, when the former cordoned off red zone of the inner city was reopened in one street. And I'll show you a few pictures in a moment. And my conclusion is that in Christchurch it seems that the boundaries between bottom-up and top-to-bottom activities are rather blurred. So they are rather perceived in a similar way, whether it's grassroots initiatives, community projects, or installations, in this case organized, the Festa City Festival by 5 schools of architecture and their students, a night of light installations in October 2012. So in summary, talking about temporary creative uses of space in cities, in particular those which experience or are experiencing major urban upheavals and rebuilds, one might look at a variety of uses and striking urban ephemeral phenomena such as transitional architecture or festivals or transitional architecture, as well as temporary art exhibitions. We are talking about art in public space under these particular conditions, and also non-commercial artist-run spaces, murals, temporary locations for club culture, do-it-yourself urbanism, finally spontaneous and anonymous graffiti, written messages and signposts left in the cityscape. So I have a little show of impressions from Christchurch, just a mix. Sometimes one doesn't even know who made this, like this garden in the sky. On the right, the mural in Petersburg Street community, one of the first streets reopened in the city center. Left a project again in Petersburg Street, and right, the Butterfly Community Project by Gepfeler. Yeah, murals, this is a rather gigantic big mural, concrete propositions, right? A pop-up mall. I included this because it's very popular and is made out of containers. And as I said, graffitis, here I hope Christchurch will legalize weed. Or a painting, also a poem on the wall. Another initiative is the Greening the Rubble initiative. And after this impressions, I had to turn back to Berlin. And as I said, I'll talk about the early 90s. The architectural critic, Philip Oswald, defined or described these undefined areas in the city historical center, Mitte, as an urban fabric of fallowland, ruins, derelict buildings, and this provided the backdrop and the inspiration for a new beginning of an East-West informal artist network. The The 90s were also famous for having launched a nomadic trap scene, and also this was a period of a feverish period of artist-run spaces, temporary exhibitions, creation of galleries, small business. And interesting, you see, I'm going beyond the topic of art. There were crossovers between the techno and the art club scene, and it is important also that there were presidents of this off-scene in brief fall of the wall Berlin in the western Kreuzberg and in the eastern Prenzlau there. So this was famous, the Tacheles ruin. Tacheles artists take over the ruin of the former department store, and also the Gemeiner Kunstverein was founded in an old factory. It became later the Kunstwerke, the KW Berlin in 1992. An outlook at on the artist-run spaces, Projekträume in today's Berlin. That was the beginning, but today Berlin is very well known for being the European artist workshop, Europäische Künstlerwerkstatt. And a very important part of it are these artist-run spaces. They are based on interdisciplinarity, participation, interaction, and focus on procedure. Séverine Margin distinguishes between three generations of artist-run spaces. The survivors from the 90s, the artist-run spaces around 2000, and the golden age of the period 2006-2007. And currently the artist-run spaces have a tendency to decline, and that is due to gentrification. I want to make somebody has to tell me that maybe I'm exceeding my time limit, you see. With my comparison, I have quite a lot to present. But this is an important point for me. I think that the term of spaces of otherness applies to Berlin, especially the subcultural climate of these creative uses of space, temporary uses of space. And again, I quote Philip Oswald, who defines the transitional as zones of otherness. Temporary activities are unstable. They transform themselves and disappear as spontaneously as they are formed. As I said, the opposition between controlled and independent spaces can be seen mainly in the subcultural city life in Berlin. Continues, I won't read the whole quote, but I mean, for me it's interesting that some of these descriptions of creative uses of space, this oppositional, this subversive character, can also be found in the Christchurch project. So if you look, for example, at Oswald says here, existing infrastructures, buildings and land reserves are activated with the most meager local resources. This allows investors without capital to actively design the city and its space. The basic rules of capitalism seem to be without power in these zones. Cultural and urban experiments can be realized practically without financial means, and then in the process often develop an enormous effectiveness. Coming now to Christchurch, there are 2 points. I said Berlin is characterized in the Aufbruch, or in the beginning, by the subversive, the anarchic almost, the subcultural, and in Christchurch this is not the case. But there's also a critical stance towards controlled space and city planning, and mainly the blueprint of the inner city rebuilt. And as Ryan Reynolds, who is the co-founder of Gerd Fuller and chairperson of Gerd Fuller, says, the lack of democracy in capitalism, where owners have more rights to determine the city. However, the Gerd Fuller projects, and I will talk a bit more about these, are largely pragmatic and on the optimistic side of the rebuild. In some of its aims and pragmatic approaches, Gerd Fuller resembles the Berlin anti-capitalistic experiments of temporary uses of space with regard to inefficient handling of infrastructures, buildings and land reserves. But we cannot talk about the subversive character of the zones of otherness In Christchurch, the projects are hardly affected by a strong subcultural climate, and something like the guerrilla tactics, for example, of the UFO club in Berlin, a techno club which moved from one place to the other and informed the patrons through telephone chains. This is something unimaginable in Christchurch, where the projects are now on the positive, on the optimistic side of the rebirth. If I look now at the aims of Gapfiller and some interesting claims made by Ryan Reynolds, mainly in a very fascinating speech. If you go on YouTube, you can see it. The speech on the adolescent city, where he also uses the term of spaces of possibilities. And so he says, our city is in a transitional period, an adolescence of sorts. We all transition from childhood to adulthood, but this is the key. The outcome is not fully known. It is not predetermined what sort of adults we will be. We come to discover ourselves through adolescence and to find our identities through trial and error and indication with others. So this psychological portrait of the city is, of course, this challenge to use space creatively, but to see how exactly that works. Looking more at the aims of Gapfiller, Gapfiller invites to come forward with ideas for uses of space for temporary, creative, people-centered purposes. Also, in addition to enriching and to enriching the cultural life of the city, these projects are utterly practical. There's also the radical rethinking at the level of social spatial politics. Gapfiller wants to turn private spaces into public ones and supports grassroots developments for this purpose. So the question is, to what extent are the projects creative, or, as Reynolds admits, even mundane, very tame and accessible, even retrogressive? And I show more pictures here, but in the past 2 years it started with the Kitschy Public Garden. There was an exhibition of photographs documenting the change in East Berlin after the fall of the wall, so that's interesting. There is the book exchange, there's a butterfly community project, there are murals, there is a cycle-powered cinema, the dance format, the poetry project, the ballet pavilion, and more murals. So it's very diverse, and one can say the more artistic projects are in conjunction with the Outer Spaces program of the Art Gallery Christchurch. So, cycle-powered cinema. There's a bit of humor in it. It refers to the Kiwi sense of engineering, Kiwi ingenuity, be practical. Or the book exchange in a fridge. The palette pavilion built by volunteers out of pallets for events, for readings, for music. It's me with Ryan Reynolds. And a mural by the mule seem to have temporarily misplaced by sense of humor. These are references to things that got lost on the earthquakes. The dance format, the coin-operated dance floor, community chess. Yeah, to conclude this chapter on Gapfiller, one has to ask, what are the political but also aesthetic dimensions of Gapfiller's dealings with space? So Ryan Reynolds says, of course they want to be critical, subversive even, but he says we are not politically minded people. We who run Gapfiller, we who are under 40 maybe, and we who live in Western capitalist democracies. And he also emphasizes the aesthetic element, which lies in the mental aesthetic impact of the new created space. Each exhibit must exhibit its singulareness and engage with existing site properties. There are certainly these therapeutic aspects I mentioned, or the state of emergency aspects in the gap filler projects. But definitely one can say that gap filler is more than a disaster response and inspires urban experimentation. And I have a bit more on my conference proceedings. I'm just wondering. Now, I just take you through a few pictures apart from these other grassroots initiatives, but to show you the outer spaces, which are now art, really transitional art in space, in urban space. But I have to say I'm pretty critical. They could have done more. I mean, they had public funding in this case. So a few examples of some murals, one here by Kay Rose, and here are the people, and here is this people, that's a children's run, another painting. They are all in the neighborhood of the art gallery building, which is closed. Or one more is this here, the most famous one is the On First Looking into Chapman's Homer by Michael Kofai, exhibited in June 2012. And in the background here is the rubble, but one has to say that this wasn't really produced or exhibited after the earthquakes, but it had already been exhibited at the Venice Biennale. It was the New Zealand contribution. I think I have just the time to take you through a few pictures. My point is I wanted to come back to the artist spaces in Berlin, because I think this is the point of comparison, the counterculture, the critical, anti-capitalistic art scene of artist spaces. And I'm not going into detail here how really anti-capitalistic they are. They have the various terms, alternative, collective, hybrid, young, and or maybe symbolic capitalist. But they play a role, and that's important for the urban regeneration in Berlin. I take one example from one artist-run project by Nina Kowalewski, which has no project group for the moment. This is typical because, as I said, they are declining. But I've gone through the archives, and themes are like habitat, dynamism, movement in urban space, reflections of the relationship between artists and collectors. Very often crossovers between visual art, sound installation performances, talks and salons, and various projects are interesting for the revival of the Potsdamer Straße. And this is a very drab district in Berlin, street in Berlin. So I end with these pictures. Well, this was in Mitte, the data rescue project, but these are the Kunstpotting and more here, so installations. And this is Potsdamer Light in December 2009. I think I exceeded my time frame. Thank you for your attention.